In December 1941, as America was licking its wounds after Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a series of attacks on Western colonies in Southeast Asia. It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country. The plan was that it should make its way south down the east coast. The invasion force was met by a contingent of British Indian troops. But after a day of fighting, they were brushed aside. Meanwhile, further north in Thailand, a second Japanese landing was unopposed. 30,000 Japanese troops were soon making their way down the western coast of Malaya. The target of the two groups, Singapore, the center of British military and political rule in the Far East. Britain had turned the island into what it believed was an impregnable fortress. But all the guns pointed south, out to sea. The Japanese were approaching by land from the north. Yet British military commanders remained remarkably untroubled. They didn't rate the Japanese as fighting men and believed the Malay jungle was, anyway, virtually impassable. But the Japanese had other ideas. To soften up Singapore, they attacked the city from the air. Britain sent the new battleship Prince of Wales and a battlecruiser, Repulse, to attack Japanese troop convoys. They were met by Japanese bombers. Both warships were sunk in less than 2 hours. Almost 1,000 of their crew were lost. It was the greatest British naval disaster of World War II. In an era of aircraft and aircraft carriers, it was now clear the battleship, for years the mainstay of the British Navy, had had its day. Back on land, the Japanese continued to head south towards Singapore. On January the 11th, 1942, Kuala Lumpur was captured. The British forces fell back and withdrew to Singapore. There were now about 100,000 British soldiers to defend it. They faced a force of only 30,000 Japanese. Even without their big guns, the British should have been able to hold out. The Japanese launched an assault in early February. It was supported by more airstrikes. The British defense was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate. Four days later, the Japanese had pushed through the last of the British defensive lines. The commander, General Arthur Percival, surrendered with over 90,000 men. Never in the history of the British Army had a commander in charge of such a large force had to surrender, and to an enemy general whose force was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Britain's 200-year-old power and prestige in the Far East had been wiped out in just 10 weeks. But it wasn't the only disaster. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the Japanese forces were equally triumphant. The British garrison in Hong Kong fought for 2 weeks before succumbing to a Japanese invasion. In the Philippines, America fared no better. Here, a preemptive bombing raid caught large numbers of US aircraft neatly lined up at Clark Field. Most were destroyed. Two days later, with US air power virtually non-existent, Japanese troops began to land. The local Philippine troops melted away. The Japanese advanced rapidly. 10 days later, Manila was captured. The US soldiers were forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. Here they hoped to hold out until a relief force could be sent. It never came. On April 3rd, 1942, Japanese troops launched a major assault on US positions. After 4 days' heavy fighting, they broke through. The Americans surrendered 2 days later. That left just one British colony in the region, Burma. In early 1942, Japanese forces pushed into the south of the country. The British defences had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance. Less than 2 months after invading Burma, the Japanese had seized the capital, Rangoon. 8 weeks later, the British had been pushed entirely out of the country. In just under 6 months, the Japanese had seized control of the whole eastern rim of the Pacific. Their oriental Blitzkrieg had been swift and crushing. Yet already, there were warning signs that they were not as powerful as they appeared.